Louis Theroux had done this show called The Most Hated Family in America.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of looked in the rearview mirror and said, I know that church. That's my family.
The power of our democracy.
So anything bad that happened to anybody in that country, and then pretty soon it's Canada, and then it's Germany, anywhere that anything pops up where it looks like they might have a little bit of humanity towards gay people, suddenly God hates them. So he's got a website that says God hates Germany. He's got one that says God hates Canada, and they're just popping up all over the place.
Yeah.
And it's just his personal.
He's got targets.
That's right.
Oh, this is interesting. For those who are listening, this is the infamous Fred Phelps we're talking about. And if you've ever seen images of people holding up signs, the most prominent one would be God hates fags, correct? That would be the most identifiable one. Yeah. Was that his very first one? I want to know, can you remember what
going back to that first pick, it was a very rudimentary compared to the signs they have now, but that was what the sign said: God hates fags. And there were a couple more there, right?
Interesting.
And then they started a web page that was for the church, and the address to the website was godhatesfags.com. So he got a lot of mileage out of that phrase, right? So,
oh, I'm sure. Was there interest generated? In other words, did the church see an uptick on its website? Did they see an uptick in membership because of this fomenting against the gay community? Or did it go down? Do you recall?
Well, there was probably a 2 or 3 year period where it stayed fairly localized or regionalized, right? And then that young man, Matthew Shepard, was killed in Wyoming. And they showed up there with their signs and was part of that circus that was his funeral.
In Wyoming?
Yeah.
Did they show up in Wyoming?
They showed up there, and that propelled them into the national spotlight. And then they just kept coming up with new ways to enrage the sensibilities of the general public, right? And then when that war started in Iraq, and the soldiers started dying, and then they started going to their funerals, and they were going to the funerals of high, visible, recognizable gay people who had died. All with that same message that because America supports gay people, God's sending those soldiers home in body bags. That was their argument. Right. And so then that, of course, turned into that lawsuit that got all the way to the Supreme Court, that they won on First Amendment rights. But all of that just got the entire country and then other countries in an uproar, right? Like he came up here to Canada once. I don't know if you recall that incident, and I think it was in Manitoba, where that young man got his head cut off on that Greyhound bus.
Yeah, Vincent Lee was the name of the assailant. Yeah.
Yeah, and they were coming up to basically say that God sent that killer because Canada was by that time we were allowing gay marriage.
Interesting. Right? I did not know they worked that in. No, yeah, get points for cleverness, I guess. Interesting. How, when all this is going on and you're watching this go on and it has international attention at this point, how deeply face-palmed are you at this point about the whole issue? And do you feel helpless that there's very little you can do about it? Or were you doing something at that time?
Well, when it first started, I got a few calls from like the local newspapers and radio stations there in Topeka, and talked a little bit about it, but I really wasn't confrontational towards them. And at the same time, I'm kind of on my own journey. I had started pulling away from the idea of God, and at least his God, and gotten involved with an evangelical free church there in California, and primarily so that my kids were socialized.
Of course. Sure.
That was a big thing for me, that I didn't want them feeling isolated like we did. But exposing myself to that, then I started asking myself the questions that ultimately led me to the conclusion that just because theirs was a kinder version of a myth, it still was a myth, right? So, but I'm still in the midst of that. And I remember distinctly when one of the first calls I got from a radio station, I was at some friend's house who I went to church with, right? So I was still involved in the whole religious thing, and was unwilling, because one of the things that I realized it took me literally decades is I continued to hold on to this idea that if I just said the right thing or did the right thing, that I could reconcile with my family. Wasn't saying or doing anything along that line, but was holding out hope, right? So then I started driving a taxi here in Cranbrook when I was able to finally get a work permit. And I picked up a young man one afternoon, and he was going back out to the airport to catch a flight back to Vancouver. And he was talking about he was getting a degree in journalism. And I kind of had an interest at that point. I was thinking about maybe doing some writing. So we were talking about that. And somehow that led to a conversation about fairness in journalism, and I said, well, I thought the BBC was one of the best that I had ever watched, that did a good job of presenting both sides of a case and without forming an opinion, right?
Right.
And he said, yeah, he said he liked the BBC. And he said, you'd just seen a show recently about this church down in Kansas. And that was that Louis Theroux had done this show called the Most Hated Family in America.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of looked in the rearview mirror. I said, I know that church. That's my family. And he's got this look on his face like, huh? Like, did I hear this right? So I just kind of smiled and pulled out my wallet and handed him my license, right? And he just like lost it. He goes, oh my God. He goes, I got to do an interview. And so by the time I got him to the airport, he had made sure that he had my phone number. That turned into an interview. He wrote a big an article for the paper, the university paper at the University of BC. And that got, I don't know, at one point, I think it was over 1 million hits.
Wow.
And suddenly I'm getting, so he sent me a message a few days after he published it, said he's got all these people trying to reach me, and he didn't want to give my contact information without my permission. So one of those people was David Silverman from the American Atheists.
Right.
And he wanted me to come. This was in October, I believe, and he wanted me to come speak at the American Atheist Convention in April of the next year. Okay. So by that time, I had read Dawkins' book and Hitchens' book, and I was really starting to feel, because prior to that, being atheist was something you were in the closet about, right? I mean, we just weren't out.
Oh, had to be, yeah.
And we grew up with the idea that the very word atheist on your tongue could put you in hell, right? So there's all that stuff working against me. So I had to spend I had to make the decision to not only at least align myself to the extent I was given a talk there, if not admit that I was atheist. And I had to make the decision that I was going to be actively opposed to my family's message.
Right.
And that was terrifying. I got to tell you, it took me several months to finally come to terms with the decision I was making.
Oh, no question. Yeah.
A part of that whole picture was that I'm starting to hear from people who are being negatively impacted by my father's campaign. And so ultimately concluded that even though I abhor publicity, I took a public speaking class in college, and I said, the one thing I know is I will never be a public speaker. Right? So all of these things working in opposition, but I thought that because I was in the position I was in, not by my own choosing, that I had a responsibility